500-pound slabs of marble, breaking free from the face of Chicago's tallest skyscraper, and falling toward one of the busiest pedestrian corridors in America. The building was a billion-dollar 83-story tower sheathed in 43,000 panels of white Carrara marble, the same stone Michelangelo once carved. When it opened in 1973, it was a triumph. By the late 1980s, it was a crisis. The eventual fix cost $80 million. But the warnings about this exact failure existed before a single panel was ever installed. This was not an unforeseeable accident. It was a deliberate gamble. On Randolph Street, just steps from Millennium Park, the daily rush of office workers and tourists was shadowed by a silent threat. The marble cladding of Chicago's tallest tower had begun to fail, not with a single dramatic collapse, but with the unpredictable violence of gravity and time. Police logs from the late 1980s record emergency calls. A thunderous crash. White stone shattered across the pavement. Crowds frozen in disbelief. One incident involved a marble panel weighing nearly 500 pounds breaking loose and plummeting to the street below. The force could crush a car or end a life in an instant. City officials scrambled to contain the danger. Barricades went up along the base of the building. Uniformed patrols and building engineers paced the sidewalks, eyes trained upward, radios crackling with updates. Temporary tunnels of heavy scaffolding shielded pedestrians from the risk overhead, but the sense of unease lingered. Randolph Street was no quiet back alley. It was a main artery, lined with shops, restaurants, and bus stops, drawing thousands of people every day. The marble panels, each one large enough to blanket a dining table, had seemed like a symbol of permanence when the building opened. Now, their thinness and fragility turned them into projectiles. Police and fire departments kept records of every falling fragment, some weighing hundreds of pounds, others splintering into sharp shards that littered the sidewalk. Emergency notices warned of potential closures, and city engineers debated whether the next piece would fall without warning. Every shift, workers and passers-by moved through a corridor of uncertainty, never sure if the next sound from above might be the start of another disaster. The city's response was urgent, but the question remained, how could a billion-dollar skyscraper become such a hazard? The answer lay not in chance, but in choices made decades earlier. In 1973, a new giant joined Chicago's skyline. The Standard Oil Building, later known as the Amoco Building, rose 1,136 feet above the city, instantly claiming the title of Chicago's tallest skyscraper. Its opening was splashed across the business pages and architectural journals, celebrated as a triumph of modern engineering and corporate ambition. The tower's most striking feature was its skin. Nearly 43,000 gleaming white panels of Carrara marble, quarried from the same Italian hills that once supplied Michelangelo. The effect was dazzling. A monolithic luminous shaft that stood out even among Chicago's boldest buildings. Behind the marble, however, was a story of image and intent. The choice of stone was no accident. Edward Durrell Stone, the building's lead architect, insisted on Carrara marble to set a tone of permanence and prestige. For the executives at Standard Oil of Indiana, the marble facade was more than decoration. It was a public statement. In an era when corporations vied for attention with ever taller, ever sleeker towers, this building would be their monument, white, immaculate, and unmistakable against the city's darker, older blocks. But the marble was unusually thin, just 1.25 inches thick, almost 40% slimmer than what most engineers then considered safe for a high-rise. The gamble was justified as a way to save weight and cost. Stone himself once described the marble as no more expensive than crumpled-up aluminum. The engineering team, under pressure to deliver the architect's vision, signed off on the unconventional specification. In the excitement of the debut, few questioned whether the marble could stand up to Chicago's brutal winters or the daily battering of wind off Lake Michigan. For a brief moment, the building was the talk of the city. Its white marble sparkled in the sun, and its height redefined the skyline. Yet beneath the acclaim, the seeds of a future crisis were already set in stone, literally, by the very decisions that made the tower famous. The decision to sheath Chicago's tallest tower in a 1¼ inch Carrara marble was a bold move, one that set it apart from every other skyscraper in the city. Most high-rise architects in the early 1970s specified stone panels at least 2 inches thick, a standard built on decades of experience with wind, weather, and the relentless cycle of freezing and thawing. But here, the marble was nearly 40% thinner. The gamble was justified in design memos by 2 arguments: weight savings and cost. With each panel weighing around 275 pounds instead of 400 pounds, the building's steel structure could be lighter, foundations could be slimmer, and the total construction budget could be trimmed. In a city famous for its engineering, the numbers carried weight. Edward Durrell Stone, the architect behind the project, described the marble as no more expensive than crumpled-up aluminum. It was an eye-catching boast, meant to reassure both the client and the public that beauty did not have to come at a premium. The thinner panels made the facade look sleek, almost impossibly smooth for a building of this scale. But the real price of that elegance was hidden in the details buried in technical reports and quietly debated among engineers. Design documents from the period show that the choice was not just about style. The 1 1/4 inch thickness was selected to keep the building's dead load within limits, allowing for a more slender frame and a savings on steel and concrete. Industry standards of the time, however, were clear. Marble used as exterior cladding on skyscrapers needed to be thicker to withstand the forces of nature. The thinner panels were more vulnerable to bowing and cracking, especially in a climate like Chicago's, where temperatures could swing by 30 degrees in a single day. The marble's beauty was undeniable, but its strength was a calculated risk. In the excitement of unveiling a new architectural landmark, the warning signs were easy to overlook. The decision to go thin was locked in, shaping not just the building's appearance, but its fate. In 1988, a team from Wyss Janney Elsner Associates, known in the engineering world as WJE, arrived on site with a mandate that went beyond routine maintenance. Their inspection logs from that year read less like a checklist and more like a catalog of distress. Hundreds of marble panels were showing visible signs of trouble: bowing, surface cracks, and in some cases a subtle but unmistakable bulge that hinted at forces working deep within the stone. The team documented panels with bellies up to 1 inch, a deformation impossible to ignore on a structure that soared over 1,000 feet above the city. Photographic evidence collected during this investigation captured the reality behind the architectural gloss. Close-ups revealed hairline fractures radiating from anchor points, faint at first but spreading further each winter. Some panels had warped so much that their edges no longer sat flush against the steel frame. The cumulative effect was alarming. It was not just a handful of isolated failures. By 1988, the damage was widespread, affecting hundreds of panels across multiple elevations, especially on the wind-battered southeast face. Inspection teams traced the distress to more than just the visible cracks. They measured the curvature of the marble, cataloged discoloration, and logged every panel that had lost its original rigidity. The findings forced a reckoning. What had once been dismissed as superficial weathering now appeared as a systemic breakdown, one that could not be solved by patchwork repairs or temporary straps. The 1988 inspection marked a turning point. The evidence was undeniable, and the question was no longer whether the marble was failing, but how, and how quickly the crisis would escalate. Thermal hysteresis became the marble's silent undoing. In the language of engineers, it describes the way a material bends and warps with each cycle of heating and cooling, never quite returning to its original shape. For the Aon Center's thin Carrara panels, Chicago's climate delivered this punishment day after day. Sunlight would warm the marble, causing it to expand. By night, the temperature dropped sharply, and the stone contracted. Water seeped into microscopic pores, froze, and then expanded, driving new cracks deeper into the marble's structure. Laboratory tests commissioned in the late 1980s told a grim story. The marble had lost up to 40% of its original flexural strength. That is not a surface blemish. It is a fundamental collapse of the stone's ability to bear its own weight. The panels, once rigid, now bowed outward by as much as 1 inch. Some had lost even more strength in the years since installation. with projections showing further decline was inevitable. The phenomenon was irreversible. Once the internal bonds in the marble had broken down, no repair could restore them. The process did not just make the panels unsightly or uneven, it rendered them brittle, unpredictable, and dangerous. A facade engineer brought in to diagnose the failure described the marble as permanently deformed. The panel's anchors, designed for a tight fit, now struggled to grip a stone that had warped beyond their reach. Even the best designed straps and braces could only buy time. The data was clear. Patching cracks or strapping panels would not reverse the damage. With a 40% loss in strength and the relentless cycle of thermal hysteresis at work, the only option left was to replace every slab. The building's skin had reached a point of no return, not because of an accident, but because the science of material fatigue had been ignored in favor of aesthetics and cost savings. The reckoning arrived in the form of a single staggering figure: $80 million. That was the price tag Amoco's board approved for the only solution left: stripping the entire tower and recladding it with stone that could withstand Chicago's climate. The decision was not made lightly. Internal memos and contract documents show weeks of debate over costs, liability, and the logistics of replacing 43,000 panels on a building that never closed its doors. But the evidence was overwhelming. Temporary straps and scaffolding could no longer guarantee safety. The marble's internal structure was too far gone. At the heart of the process stood Shelby Pierce, Amoco's facilities manager. Tasked with overseeing the crisis, Pierce described the situation as a nightmare for any building operator. You don't get to choose the weather, but you do have to answer for the stone. The board's final vote authorized a full reclad, and with it, a material change that would define the tower's next chapter. Carrara marble was out. In its place, the team selected Mount Airy granite, quarried in North Carolina, a stone known for its strength, density, and proven durability on high-rises. Each new panel would be 2 inches thick, far heavier and more robust than the failed marble. The contract, valued at approximately $80 million, covered not just the granite, but also the engineering, labor, and safety measures required to keep the building occupied during construction. The approval set in motion one of the largest facade replacement projects ever attempted on an occupied skyscraper. From that moment, there was no turning back. The building's iconic white skin would be peeled away, panel by panel, and replaced with granite designed to last. The financial commitment was enormous, but the alternative, a city block at risk every winter, was no longer acceptable. Replacing the skin of an 83-story skyscraper, while it remained fully occupied, called for a construction effort on a scale rarely attempted. Crews faced the task of removing and replacing 43,000 marble panels, each one weighing hundreds of pounds, without disrupting the daily life of thousands of workers inside. To keep the building operational and the streets below safe, engineers designed a system of steel scaffolding that wrapped the entire tower like a cocoon. High-capacity cranes, anchored to the roof and the neighboring structures, hoisted new granite panels up the sheer face of the building while lowering the failed marble slabs back down to ground level for disposal. Each panel had to be detached, maneuvered through narrow staging areas, and swapped out with precision, floor by floor. From street level to the 83rd story. The logistics demanded round-the-clock coordination, deliveries scheduled to the minute, wind speeds monitored before every lift, and safety harnesses checked for every worker at height. The entire operation unfolded above one of Chicago's busiest downtown corridors, a living demonstration of what it takes to undo a design gamble written in stone. Randolph Street's transformation from a bustling thoroughfare into a construction zone left a mark on daily life that numbers alone can't capture. Steel tunnels and sidewalk sheds stretched for blocks, forcing pedestrians to navigate narrow, dim corridors beneath the shadow of the tower. For shop owners and restaurant managers along the street, every day behind the barricades meant fewer customers and quieter registers. Merchant Association surveys from the early 1990s recorded a drop in weekly sales of 10 to 15% during periods of street closure, a blow felt most acutely by small businesses already operating on thin margins. City records show that permits for sidewalk and lane closures stretched across several months, with some sections of Randolph Street blocked off entirely, while crews worked overhead. The constant hum of construction, dust in the air, and a sense of unease about falling debris drove foot traffic away. These disruptions didn't just inconvenience passers-by, they reshaped the economic rhythm of the block, turning a design failure high above into a daily hardship for those at street level. Warnings about the risks of thin marble were present in the engineering world long before the first panel ever left Carrara. Technical journals and professional guidelines in the late 1960s described how a stone less than 2 inches thick could bow and fracture under repeated temperature swings. Yet no internal memo or meeting record from the building's design team has ever surfaced to show that these concerns were formally raised or heeded during planning. The decision to proceed with 1¼ inch marble was locked in, shaped by aesthetic ambition and cost calculations, rather than by the full weight of material science. When disaster became undeniable, the consequences stretched far beyond a single building. The city's regulators and building officials, faced with the fallout on Randolph Street, began to question whether Chicago's inspection rules were strong enough to prevent future failures. In 1996, the city adopted the Facade inspection ordinance, requiring every building over 80 feet tall to undergo regular hands-on exterior checks by licensed engineers or architects. The new rules mandated scaffold-based inspections, formal reporting, and repair programs, measures designed to catch hidden dangers before they could threaten the public. The Aon Center's marble crisis became a touchstone for code reform, a reminder that shortcuts in design can have consequences measured not just in dollars, but in lives and city policy. The story stands as a caution. Architecture's boldest visions demand respect for the limits of the materials that bring them to life. Today, every high-rise in Chicago faces mandatory facade inspections, a direct legacy of this calculated risk. The Aon Center's crisis wasn't an accident. It was a warning. As cities reach higher and materials push limits, every shortcut in design becomes a public safety bet. The true cost isn't just measured in dollars, but in trust, earned or lost, one decision at a time. Share your thoughts below.